Maybe it's a little bit pretentious to talk first, but since the topic I took up was more kind of general place setting of much of what Ian has been doing, and the other questions related more to, to more recent work within that framework. There are 3 points that Ian mentioned in his comments here that I would like to expand a little bit on. The first has to do with the label social constructivism. I agree with Ian that we should avoid labels. The only reason I put a label into the title of my talk was that, of course, Ian has used it, but also because I think that label social constructivism tends to go together with a certain kind of relativism, and I wanted to show that that's not necessary. It is compatible with the notion of objectivity. But like Ian, I think that the fact that it is so often connected with relativism means that as soon as you use it, people will think about relativism. And there's a lot of rather violent controversy connected with any use of constructivism in debates. And my own view on labels, not just these labels, but labels like positivism, analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, and so on, is that we should avoid them, because I think they tend to close people's mind. You put a label on something, and if you have a negative attitude to that label, you can comfort yourself by feeling, well, that's an area I don't have to read anything about because they are clearly wrong. And of course, given as much as is published now, of which we get time to read only a tiny little bit, it's comforting to know that large parts of that are things we don't need to worry about. So social constructivism would often be used that way, but also lots of these other labels. So the first point is simply avoid these labels and go to the issues themselves. The second point had to do with my beautiful drawing. This duck-rabbit picture is, of course, known to all of you. And it's a picture, as Ian pointed out. And Wittgenstein uses it and forgets that it's a picture. Wittgenstein develops a whole theory of perception on the basis of seeing something as something. And of course, it's a picture that is then seen as a duck or seen as a rabbit. Husserl never uses it that way. This picture is not used by Husserl. Husserl is very interested in the fact that we are always experiencing things directly. There are no intermediaries. So there are no sense data, no pictures. And when I give lectures and have more time to make nice drawings, I make a horizon below here. So what we see would be a silhouette. And when we think about the example, we should think of being out, seeing against the sky as a silhouette above a hilltop, for example, this thing. And then we ask, is this a duck or is that a rabbit? Forget about this being a picture. But in Gestalt psychology, they tended to focus on pictures, which is reasonable. They wanted to print it on the page. And Wittgenstein was so taken in by that he develops a quite mistaken view on perception, based on all perception is seeing something as something. Husserl would drop that first something. There's nothing here that we see as something. And that brings me to the third point, and that had to do with Ian's example about our seeing immediately how this person is like the child who wants to touch something but they're a little afraid and so on. And we see that immediately if we are not autists. And I think the autist discussion by Ian is very, very helpful in that way. And that again illustrates a point by Husserl. When we are encountering other persons, we don't encounter a body and then perform some kind of inference to the fact that this is a person. There's no intermediary. We are just experiencing a person. And experiencing a person means experiencing somebody as somebody who also is experiencing this same world, but from a different perspective, with emotions, desires, feelings, and so on. And all of this Husserl discusses at length in these 6,000 pages on intersubjectivity. For him, the basis of ethics is that we are able to experience other persons as something that matters to them, as experiencing what happens as something that matters to them, something of value, something that disvalue, and so on. So the basis for all the ethical distinctions is already there in our experiencing other people as people and not just as bodies. So I think this direct experience of the objects is central in Husserl and gives a key to all of this. And as Ian has brought out in his writings, autist people have some difficulties in experiencing certain of these aspects of the other, which we tend to experience immediately. And one kind of treatment that could help them would then be to be made aware of certain cues that will help them to overcome this handicap. That was what I wanted to say about Ian's comments here.
Of course, Ian, you are the guest of honor, so you will be allowed to break in any time and comment. So if you want to comment, you are allowed to.
Was it that bad?
Was it that bad?
I would like to leave the Wittgenstein out of it because, first of all, I decline to be a Wittgenstein scholar. That's a specific thing to say. I'm not a Husserl scholar. I decline to be a Wittgenstein scholar. My intellectual life is as much influenced by Wittgenstein as by Foucault, but I don't want to be an interpreter of Wittgenstein. But I don't read Wittgenstein's discussion of seeing as in the same way that Dagfinn does. But that's just for the record. It's not an argument. The other two we pass.
Yeah.
Except with respect to autistic children, you see, it's a specific lack. They're great on objects. In fact, they're better on objects than so-called normals, or what autistics like to call neurotypicals. They're better on objects and better on noticing details about objects than you or I are. There's a curious inversion which must tell something about human neurology and how the phenomena which interested Husserl and which I read with fascination in Köhler actually work in the human brain mind.
So I think we keep the original order. So if you have a comment, Bruna, you are welcome.
Yes, just a few things. But first one, thank you for making me notice where I took you wrong. Now the problem is what I do with my written text. Do I put a note that I took him wrong? But that's the second thing is something that I'm very passionate about, and this is the issue of numbers. Because, of course, quantification, I agree with what you said, it's important, we have to... But what is in those numbers? And sometimes there is nothing in those numbers. And this is my point. It's not against numbers, which would be totally stupid. But even in my own field, you have to produce the numbers. So pretend that you have done a survey, which is a representative sample, which is more often than not, is not even a random sample, and you have to provide the numbers. As soon as you provide your input in numbers, nobody questions the numbers. Now, I'm exaggerating, of course, but, you know, it's... and now I would say that the power of computers, where it's so easy to produce numbers, nobody, you know, wonders what is in the numbers. So there is all the attention goes in the elaboration of the representation of the data, and very little attention goes into the collection, the quality of the information, which is then transformed into the number. And this to me is really, in a way, dangerous. And also the other thing is you have to provide numbers about everything. For example, now there is a trend in European projects, for example, that you have to provide the indicators of good governance. Of course, governance is not even defined, good governance less so, but you have to provide indicators and numerical indicators. So my passion and my resistance is that, of course, numbers, but you know, what is inside those numbers? The second thing is it's maybe just a marginal note. It's very interesting what you said about the precautionary principle, because in the risk literature there is this kind of classification of risk versus uncertainty and then ignorance, and then someone spoke of square ignorance. It was called squared ignorance, so something that we don't know, we don't know. But then now the language has changed, and we talk of known known, known unknown, and unknown unknown, which comes from Ramsay, and he's quoted in connection with the precautionary principle and the invasion in Iran. So actually, this is it's quoted as an application of the precautionary principle. Of course, in a totally different setting, but in the literature you find that the Ramsay actually defined and applied the precautionary principle. The last thing, which is just something which resonated in my ear, so I may be banal, but if I had to refrain from speaking whenever I say something banal, I would never talk. So the idea, there is this insistence of what I see, so the insistence of sight. And I wonder about our neurology. You know, there are so many other senses, well, not so many other, 2 other senses, through which we perceive. And apparently we pay very little attention of that. And I'm sure there is a lot of research done on blind people, and I think there might be some inspiration there. Because, of course, we are captured by what we see, by the images, but I'm sure there is much more there.
Again, if you want to comment.
Okay, just a footnote to the main remark that about computers, that the statistical techniques which are used are basically statistical techniques which were developed in the early 20th century. All the major tests that are still used, there may be variations on them, more sophisticated, they're basically things developed in the early 20th century by people who were very close to the data and understood the questions, and where first of all, it was very expensive to do a calculation because you had 6 young women, underpaid, cranking away on a hand calculator, churning out the numbers which were required. So you were very cautious in thinking what hypotheses made sense. And you only considered variables which you thought you had some understanding of and which you would enrich your understanding of by statistical analysis. Now there are, unfortunately, an enormous number of people who are trained in how to manipulate these formulas and how to punch numbers into calculators or into computers. So you can do an analysis of variance, and you will find various kinds of factors which will come out as significance in the analysis of variance, although it's all post hoc. That is, you're just looking around for some numbers which will produce something. And I believe that is in a way, it's a different kind of harm than the ones that you address, but it underlies some of the harms that you address. And it seems to me I don't have any idea how to do anything about that. I'm in my little way, when I used to teach Introduction to Philosophy of Probability and Statistics, many students would come up to me who, I was a sort of freshman, second year Canadian course, and 200 odd people in it. And a significant number of students would come up to me and said, how come they don't explain things in our statistics course? We just have to crank these things out. You actually explain why most of the stuff we're doing is worthless, because we've been told how to process sort of 800 variables. And now I see it doesn't make any sense. Well, I try to do that, and real statisticians know that. My favorite statistician says, if you can't explain it on the back of an envelope, it's bad statistics. But you can't convince the universe of that. So that also is a job for a public intellectual to undertake, and would do more good to the universe if they could convince people than anything I've ever done.
So Merle, you are next.
Well, for once, I don't have that much to say, actually. Which is a good moment. At least it's a learning experience for me in any case. But I do have a question following up on Dagfinn, and this is a bad question because it risks getting us into a discussion about Wittgenstein and so on. But in order to avoid that problem, I thought I should explain why I wanted to ask this question. And that is that I think it says something about the way in which we research people focus on knowledge and the way we interact with it, as opposed to the way in which other people do. And I'm referring to your talk about Wittgenstein's understanding of the use of the duck rabbit as seen as. And it struck me when you said this that what was interesting was not so much that Wittgenstein misunderstood this initially, but that misunderstanding was picked up by Kuhn, who used it to explain how normal science can move to revolution. And that was a very fruitful use, even if it was a misunderstanding of the first. And this brings us back to a sort of interesting problem we have when we are communicating with the rest of society, which is that often we focus on the truth value of claims without recognizing that the truth value doesn't necessarily always have a one-to-one correspondence with the utility of the claim, that you could sort of base your belief on something flawed but still achieve a positive outcome.
Yeah, should I?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. First, what exactly Wittgenstein meant on this is a little hard. I agree with Ian that I think Wittgenstein scholarship is much harder than, for example, Husserl scholarship, because in Wittgenstein you just find some fragments, and it's up to you to find a systematic view which fit in with the fragments, so you have much more leeway. But there's a good deal on perception in Wittgenstein, which I think is stimulated by this idea that we see something as something. But when it comes to Kuhn, when you mention, I think he is not really so much affected by Wittgenstein's possible view on perception, but he is simply aware of the fact that we put so much structure into this, and he wants to look at the consequences of putting all that structure in. So I don't think his application of this structuring idea is much influenced by Wittgenstein having this intermediary. Mm-hmm. There are other things that we could come back to, but I will not dominate too much.
Okay.
Now, I think we should open this discussion to the audience. So now all the comments, we should not restrict this just to these 3 topics. I mean, any topic. I mean, maybe you have some questions you have been thinking about. Now you have Ian Hacking here, you have the panel. Now you ask or you comment, something you wanted to say. This is your last chance. So you will have to do it now. Who wants to be the first? We are waiting. There is a mic.
I have a mic. As a member of the Holberg Committee, I shouldn't really ask any questions, but I just want to know what you're working on now, because what strikes me about your work is that you've moved from radically different topics. And I know how hard it is to learn everything one needs to learn to move to a completely new subject. So what I want to know is, what are you working on now, and what will you be doing the next 5 years?
What I want to do in the first 3 months of next year is to write the second half of the lectures which Dagfinn held up, called Scientific Reason, which I try to give an explanation of the project in my acceptance speech tomorrow. And so you will hear, I don't know how public those events are, but they are public, so anybody who wants to know what I want to do and what I want to finish in the next 3 months, what I began in 1982, that's the answer. There are various other projects I have on my list. I ought to have finished, as one person in this room knows full well, a work on classification of natural kinds. And it's finished, but I just haven't gone through it for the last time and can never find a moment to do it in. And there's another small, much more public project to be published in a small trade book, which is about the ways in which biotechnology which will certainly have an enormous effect on the physical details of our lives in the next few decades, the ways in which biotechnology will affect our sense of who we are. The book will just be published under the title Identities, but which really the real title is something like Biosocial Identities, how our identities will be affected by the developments of various kinds of biotechnology. So there's three things which I consider on various parts of the burner.
A question about autism, and also about these remarks about perception in Wittgenstein's later philosophy. There is also another drawing there, which is a kind of children drawing of a face, which is very simplistic. And that drawing is very interesting because it is not only used as a philosophical example, but it is also taken from the history of diagnostic, as far as I know. And it's used as a drawing in order to diagnose Asperger's syndrome. And the interesting thing about that is that there is a distinction there in Wittgenstein between abstraction and pattern recognition. So the problem for a person with Asperger's syndrome is that he or she is able to recognize a pattern, but is not able to make the abstraction. So if you draw a face that is not round, like in the simplistic drawing there, but draw it as a box, that person will have severe difficulties of recognizing the second drawing, even though you explained that the first, in fact, was representing a face. And the reason for me to pick up on this is that there is not only an epistemological problem there, but of course there is also an ethical problem involved in that kind of diagnosis. Because it creates a knowledge that there's something deficient, something lacking in that person, that he or she does not have the ability to kind of order the world, understand the world in which the ways that we do. However, for instance, when it comes to people with autism, there is an emphasis of, okay, how do you set the table, for instance, in the day-to-day life? How do you set the table? And of course, this is a huge problem for a person with autism, because it is difficult to, that person is challenged to kind of overcome these deficiencies in order, okay, you should place if the glass is placed in a different order, then that will pose a huge problem. Another example is, for instance, with people with schizophrenia, which many of them have a huge problem of making choices. Yeah. But they are all the time kind of given these questions of, so do you want orange juice or tomato juice? Which poses a huge problem. So I think there's connected to, I'm not sure if I got my kind of question, but there is connected to this problem of perception, there is also connected a problem of practice, and which also has some ethical ramifications. Maybe, I don't know if that's useful for us to come.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, that is a good exposition of some aspects of autism, and I guess one of the ethical questions to which you allude is the extent to which it should be an appropriate project to make people with autism as people with non-severe autism as normal as possible, or whether it is preferable at least to give them the option of simply being different. Within autism activism communities, there are really enormous disagreements. And a great deal of hostility when one actually starts getting close to visiting these communities and meeting with different communities, so that there's one organization called Cure Autism Now, called CAN, which another part of the autism community, another kind of autism community, says is absolutely wrong. We don't want to be cured, we want to be ourselves. Now that is partly a representation that the CAN people are actually concerned with much more severely afflicted autistic children. Children who under no circumstances does one feel comfortable in saying, well, let them be who they are, because they aren't really anybody in our kind of world. Whereas the anti-cure people are really often people who would have been merely diagnosed, merely thought of in the community as odd until 20 years ago, and would never have found a label for themselves. So there are subtleties within the expression autism, which people try to overcome with the terminology of an autistic spectrum, which in my opinion, because I'm really a physicist, is wrong, because spectra are linear. And one thing that autism isn't is linear. It's a manifold going off in all sorts of directions and so forth. So there's a lot of problems in which you mentioned, which you gave a coherent exposition, and thank you.
Yeah. So we have another one, yes.
Yes, I would like to come back to Mo Jacobs' talk on your role as a public intellectual, or construction of your role as a public intellectual. Just to pick up on what you ended your comment with, which was that you see yourself as working in a way that Michel Foucault described as a new role for an intellectual that breaks with the tradition, the French tradition of Jean-Paul Sartre and the likes. You then went on to say that your writings are in many ways ironic, or that your style is ironic, and you describe this as a defect. And you related it to kind of an insecurity or an insecurity, or in face of the complexity of the world, this is a strategy, or that kind of thing. I was just wondering, could this irony be tied to the role of the intellectual and to the new role of the intellectual, so that it is not only explained as a personal strategy to cope with complexity, but as being integral to the role of a public intellectual today?
Well, yes, look, because I meant irony in a not particularly favorable way when speaking to myself. Richard Rorty, it is well known, I believe, made irony a principal part of his public philosophy, and far more of a public philosopher than me, and held that the public philosopher pontificating, to use a bad ironical word, on public issues of human rights and the like, has a certain ironic stance, which I understand to be that he is fully aware and takes for granted that there is no foundation, no fundamental argument for the strong moral position which he takes, but he is still entitled to take it. Now that is one concept of irony which is certainly readily understandable, and it's self-conscious, deliberate, and desired by Rorty, and many people might, perhaps I might in certain circumstances, subscribe to that. when I spoke of my irony, I think there's a kind of hidden cruelty in some of the irony. So that if you see, so my wife used to say when I was doing some of the multiple personality stuff, you know, the people, and she was here referring to some, but only some of the experts, those people are evil. Why don't you just come out and say they are shits? You know? And instead, for anyone who reads carefully can see that I really hate some of those people, but I never come out and say it. And that perhaps I think is probably a moral defect in not saying it more explicitly.
Yes. Then I have two more people on my imaginary list. And then Roger wants to ask a question to all the members of the panel. I think he should be allowed to, but first this one. And then we close. So, I mean, now you don't have to raise your hands anymore. Please.
Okay, my question is more directed to Professor Jacob and the idea of being a public intellectual. In our lifetimes, the global population has tripled, and yet our sources of so-called information and communication have increased by more than 1,000-fold. So the idea of being an intellectual used to be that you had the time to sit and reflect and look at your society. Now the society is going past at an enormous pace, and the reaching of the public is done by the media. The media mediates. And yet the idea of an intellectual sitting distanced and reflecting is at odds with becoming a public intellectual. And what then do you think are the trends that are coming now for intellectualism? Obviously philosophers have an important view. Are you going to have to unionize in order to get your own channel?
I can just imagine a union of philosophers. That ought to be entertaining, at least. Well, I think that when my stance on the public intellectual, I have to confess, is more of a normative rather than an empirical one. I have a problem with the business of the media mediating. And I think it's problematic for me, both from the standpoint of the academic who wants to communicate with the public, and for the public who wants to be informed. Because I think that this role of the media mediating has disempowered the citizen from actually sort of going out and seeking after information that he or she wants to access. That it's a kind of, I don't say that the media doesn't have the role of being the third estate, etc. But I think media mediating has been a cop-out for people to sit on their sofas and do nothing. So in that sense, I think my position is a normative one, in that I not only imagine academics wanting to communicate with the public, but I also imagine that the public wants to do something other than be fed information or be mediated to information. But if I take the second part of your question, which is the business about that there are so many sources of information and there's so much to keep up with, well, that's why I think that it's the role of the public intellectual has changed. We cannot, any of us, expect to be able to sit and take positions on a myriad of different issues. This is why I think that in some respects our role or expectations with respect to the public intellectual have to be changed. And that is that you can't expect this person to go out and be a generalist, but what you can expect or demand of them is to use their disciplinary or interdisciplinary or specialized competence to reflect on issues that have a bearing on that. And in that sense, the public intellectual becomes a lot more circumscribed from the sort of big picture that Sartre and those people represented. So, and it becomes a little easier for academics to do and retain their dignity.
I think we go, this is the second last question, yes?
Yes. Well, first I want to thank for an inspiring talk, and I heard that you mentioned Bruno Latour as you admired, and then I wondered. He has also, as you said, moved away from the social constructivist term, and he tries with, for example, terms like hybrid, where he tries to have a symmetrical explanation from the social and the non-social. So I wondered just if you have any views on the hybrid notion of Bruno Latour. Thank you.
Yes. Of all the people whose fields of interests intersect with mine and who is more or less of my generation, I'm older than him, there is nobody from whom I have learned more. And I usually learn it about 8 years after he said it. That is, I read it first time round and I think, this is rubbish. Bruno, you have gone too far. Oh, stop it. But about 8 years later, I say, you're really on to something. Now, I am still at the oh, stop it stage with respect to the hybrids. The hybrid, of course, he's pointing to something very important that, I claim to be able to read in Descartes about how extensions of the human body change what the human body is. So sometimes Bruno does this in a mocking way when he says the National Rifle Association has got it half right and half wrong, this American organization, when it says that people kill, guns don't. But really what they're pointing to is that this is hybrid, the people and the man and the gun, or the woman and the gun who kills. And that's a different object from the gun or the man. It's a hybrid which is operative here. And I believe that's a very useful way of thinking about ourselves and our complicated prosthetics. All the things which we use, whether it's the keyboards or even just plastic bottles that we use instead of drinking with our hands, that throughout we tend to think of the human being as being a sort of a body who is bounded at my fingertips and so on, and that is just not the case. And part of the metaphor of the hybrid is to remind us of how we are constantly extending ourselves in all sorts of directions by what some people partly ironically call prosthetics. So that part of the hybrid story I believe is quite workable. But then another part of it is his which runs on from that is his idea of the parliament of things. And there I really don't go along with him at all. So there's an answer to where I am at my present learning from Bruno Latour.
So, Holberg, you will be the last one, and you will ask the question, and then you answer. That will be the final word. So.
I think I'll return to the title of Omers this morning. Science and Society in the 21st Century, the role of the public intellectual. Actually, you didn't say much about the relationship between science and society in the 21st century, other than that we have to prove why we should be funded. And however, in Bruno's talk, we got to think about the sort of global environmental resource technical challenges that we are facing then. And I'd like to ask the entire panel, really, about whether you see the role of the public intellectual also as having some kind of moral obligation to attend to these challenges, and perhaps also whether you see, or in what ways you see scholarships as Professor Hackings as a resource in this. I think in our reading, here in Bergen at least, when we have been talking about these things, we see a big potential in hacking scholarship. That is something we can use in our struggle about these things, and perhaps a bit along the ways of Bruna de Marqui's suggestion of sort of reappraising Toulmin's diagnosis of fighting for reasonableness, or the location or the place for reasonableness. I noticed that Professor Hacking said that, you know, US is a hyper-democracy, numbers are a function of the democratic procedure, and this is why the precautionary principle can't really get a stronghold there. But if we get defeatistic about that, at least from a Scandinavian perspective, then future is not very bright looking, I think. So in a sense, how could we use, for instance, the work on statistics and things like that to move ahead and reshapes the relationship between science and society? I think in a sense also Husserl is pointing towards this, because Husserl is not only talking about the innocent everyday experience. I mean, it's the crisis of the European civilization. So in that sense, I think we have 1 century history of thinking about this thematic.
So you want all the members of the panel to comment on this?
Perhaps let's start with
First
one
to
end or the
Merle,
other.
and then we go to Merle first, yes.
Me first.
Okay, you start.
Why are you picking
We
on
started
me?
out with you see, that's why I thought, but okay.
You know, the public intellectual, I would say the intellectual, and I would say the citizen. So I would say this is a question or a moral imperative that applies to everyone. In whichever role one has in society, I think is normatively, he should or she should engage in his own terms and possibilities in a way, in asking questions and possibly looking for answers which are not narrowly constrained by a discipline or a tradition. And I think this is why I'm so fascinated by Ian's thought, because it really, moves around. I think it's transdisciplinary is not a word that I like very much, but really, moving around fields of issues and fields of interest. So I think this is a question, Roger, that does not apply only to the intellectual, but to any citizen in our society. In my own experience, I am a sociologist and I do a lot of research, I talk with people. So, of course, I do survey, but also I try to put myself in the position of listening, not just talking. And this is, a friend of mine says that it may not be by chance that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So very often the intellectuals talk and they forget to listen. And so I think this is, it's important. Very, very simple.
So we should just go on to Jean. You want to comment, although you, because this will be your final remark.
Yes, these are questions for every citizen. But most citizens do not have the leisure, the time, or energy to think and spend a lot and read and talk and so forth. I have been very privileged because I've been paid a living wage, not often very much more than a living middle-class wage, but basically a living middle-class wage for thinking about things in considerable depth. And so I think that there is a particular kind of responsibility that one has to return to what we just call society, which is paying me in the end in their taxes. And so I think there is something different for the paid thinker than for the citizen who has to go and fix the roof when it leaks. So I do think there is a different question there. On the other hand, I personally do not find the question of a relation between science and society pressing on me. It may be because I'm fairly comfortable talking to scientists and I don't feel this barrier. I find that scientists are in virtually any science, are very eager to talk to anyone who expends the energy and time and intellect which I am allowed to spend in my career, but which most citizens are not able to spend. But they're very, so I have the blessing, what's given me by society, by taxpayers, to interact with scientists in ways, and yet not be a scientist, in ways that most people do not. So this, I think, makes me a bad person to reflect on science and society, because I don't feel the separation in the way in which many of the people whom you discussed with do. That's just, again, that's a little bit in the form of a confessional.
Now
Okay,
it's
yes,
your turn.
I have to say something now. I think, one, I should begin with a clarification, and that is that when I say science and society, here I am being a victim of my 20 plus years of time in the European context, because I mean science as Wissenschaft. Here I mean both natural, social sciences, and so the whole shebang. So, and yes, I agree with Roger. I did not address the question of what it should be the relation between science and society in the 21st century, apart from discussing the vague notion that we are experiencing a certain sort of relevance pressure or accountability pressure. One of the reasons I didn't take up this issue is that I think that it is still an open-ended question, and that the relevance accountability response is the policymaker response. But this is not a response that we as a community have to accept. We can, one, choose to mold that response in different ways and you know, massage it, etc., like we normally do. Another is that we can reject it if we have something else to put in place. But I suspect the reason that we don't come up with, you don't find anybody saying, well, it should be like this or it should be like that, apart from the people who are willing to be put on record of saying that everything was better before, which is the whole of the University of Oslo, of course. The reason is that we have no other alternative. We have not been in the business of thinking about this. And that, I think, is a shame. That whether we are social scientists, natural scientists, humanists, or whatever, there has been no meta-reflection. And this is a part of a growing problem within academia, and the way in which sort of our change in ideal of science and what is knowledge, that we have now started, you know, teaching people not to be scholars, but to be able to achieve the learning outcomes in the curricular plan, so that we are not really in a position to reflect on big questions. And that, I suppose, should be the question that we should be reflecting on. Why do we suck so much at being scholars? And what is the place of scholarship in the academy today? Do we want scholars around? Because it could be a very destabilizing mission if we are in the business of providing learning outcomes, to have scholars around, because they just make things, you know, difficult. And this is kind of, I think this is basically my little contribution to things. This is my excuse, my legitimation for doing the navel gazing, which is my research specialty. And that is that I am a university scholar who specializes in studying the university as an organization. And this would be, for normal lay people, the sort of characteristic. I am like a caricature of the navel gazing, caricature of the academic. You know, it's, in spite of all my talk about the public, blah, 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 so on, when you find me, you know, on an everyday basis, I am sort of gazing inwards to the organization. And my excuse for doing that is that we really need to address the question of institutional change at the university in order to be able to be better at dealing with the demands of society on science.
Friend, you
Yeah.
have the final word.
Yeah. First, I think that we all have a great responsibility for using the abilities and the competence that we have for the benefit of society and our fellow human beings. And I agree with Ian on that. And I think it's not only because we have been paid by the society, but it's a kind of human commitment. I'm sure Ian agrees on that too. So if you could manage to do this without all that support from society, that would be fine. We still have the responsibility. And then I look upon the responsibilities that we have not just as a kind of public activity, but our main responsibility is, of course, to do our field, scholarship, whatever, in a good way. We have to try to contribute to the field that we are working on. And that will help both ourselves and others to be able also, in a second step, to assist society and fellow beings in the problems that face them. And what should we then do in our preparation for that? That influences, of course, how we teach our field. And I think that there are some ingredients that should go into the teaching of any field, including philosophy. One is that we should really give the students a respect for seeing what is being done also by others. It's important to listen to what others have been doing and also read what others are doing. I tend, when I refer manuscripts or journals, for example, to feel that if the person writes in a vacuum without really knowing that lots of other people have done very similar things, even better things, that's a very big negative factor about this. If you want others to read what you do write, then you should also be willing to read what they write. So we should not be autistic in our work in our own field. But then we should, in addition to that, of course, try to bring the subject forward. And one important factor in philosophy, I think, is to try to be able to be clear about issues so that we can help people, others in our society, to see more clearly what is going on, what are dangers to watch out for, and so on. And also we should train our students to try to communicate. You know, even Husserl, for example, is one of my heroes. He was not very good at communicating. He wrote in an extremely messy way. And when I recommended you to read both Husserl and Ian, it's because Ian is able to communicate, a very important factor missing in Husserl. And then the problem is, with whom should we communicate? And the word public intellectual seems to mean that our main communication should happen in the public media. But I think we can often achieve much more by sitting down with people who are to make decisions, sitting down and going through issues with them, and listen and not just talk. And what is especially dangerous for philosophers is that we tend to go to people and tell them what is right and what is wrong, and say, do this and do not do this. This is particularly dangerous in ethics, because there we are studying what to be right and what is wrong. And I thought I would end by saying a little bit about the ethics program that Bernd has now been sharing for many years, because I think there the idea has been, since the program was initiated in 1991 with very generous support of the Research Council, that we want people who work in ethical issues to also know the field where these issues arise. We don't want people who are just philosophers studying ethics come into other fields and telling them what to do. In order to be able to know what to do, you have to really know the field itself. And therefore, we gave a lot of fellowships to people who already had a PhD in some other field. We really knew that well. It could be nuclear physics, it could be economics, and so on. And they should then take a second PhD, really spending a lot of years, 4 or 5 years, getting well into ethical problems, as good as any philosophers could get it, and then being able to combine these things, solid knowledge of the field, plus a lot of reflection about rightness, wrongness, and considerations that are relevant. And I think that kind of double competence is one that would be very important for philosophers also, as much as possible to have. And I think Ian illustrates that. He has a very solid grounding in fields that are highly relevant to philosophy, and then he reflects on them, bringing in examples from lots of other fields. And I think that's the way a public philosopher should act.
They were the final words. This is the end. So I want to thank the speakers, including, of course, the Holberg laureate in hacking, and the audience. Thank you very much. But before we close, yes, first applause, yes. you.